On July 23, 1980, 31-year-old Helen Hagness stood with her husband Giannis outside their apartment building on New York's Upper West Side. Helen kissed Giannis and told him she would see him later, and then she turned and began walking to work. It was early evening, and Helen could already tell it was going to be another hot New York summer night. It was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was humid. As Helen walked, she could already feel herself starting to sweat, and she just hoped she would still look okay when she got to work. She was dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, but her platinum blonde hair and makeup were perfectly styled, like she was going to a formal event. And in her hand, Helen carried an oblong case that held her most prized possession in the whole world, her violin. Helen had grown up as a musical prodigy, becoming an award-winning pianist at the age of 4 and a skilled violin player at the age of 8. Now, Helen was a highly accomplished violinist, and she had performed with symphonies and opera and ballet companies all over Europe and North America. Helen made her way through the city and eventually turned onto a street about 10 blocks from her house. Up ahead, she saw the Metropolitan Opera House, or the Met as it's known, and her face lit up. Helen had dreamed about playing violin at the Met ever since she was a little girl, and she still couldn't believe that she was getting paid to come to this beautiful opera house to work alongside some of the most talented artists in the world. She turned onto a side street that led around the Met, and she entered through the backstage door. She smiled at a few Met employees and stagehands who were rushing back and forth getting ready for the night's ballet performance. Then Helen walked down a long, brightly lit hallway and went into the dressing room that was reserved for the women in the orchestra. Some of the other musicians had already arrived, and they all talked and laughed while they got dressed. Helen opened her locker and changed out of her street clothes into a black shirt, black pants, and black shoes. She took a blue flower from her locker and fastened it to her hair with a bobby pin. Then, a little before 8 p.m., about an hour after she had arrived, Helen took her place in the orchestra pit with the rest of the musicians. The roar of the applause flooded the theater, the house lights dimmed, the curtain rose, and the orchestra conductor turned to the musicians and waved his hand. Helen felt butterflies in her stomach. Even after all these years of playing, she still got nervous and excited. She raised her violin to her shoulder, placed her bow on the strings, waited for her cue, and started to play. About 40 minutes later, Helen heard the audience applauding once again. She had lost herself in the music like she always did, and so the first act of the ballet had sort of flown by in a blur. The curtain closed and the lights came up. It was the first of 2 intermissions. Helen placed her prized violin on her chair in the orchestra pit and headed backstage. She wasn't playing for the next section of the performance, and so she had an extended break. Helen walked right to the backstage elevator. She wanted to meet with the lead male dancer in the ballet, a famous Russian named Valery Panov. The elevator doors opened, and Helen stepped inside and stood between a man and a young ballerina. Helen told the ballerina she was going to see Panov, but she couldn't remember where his dressing room was. The ballerina said she didn't know either. Panov was a huge star, and he had his own dressing room that was separate from the rest of the dancers. Then the man chimed in and said Panov was on the 3rd floor. Helen thanked him, hit the button for the 3rd floor, and the elevator doors closed. The young ballerina stepped off the elevator at her dressing room floor. Then Helen rode up another floor, got off the elevator, and walked down a long hallway in search of Panov's dressing room. At 11:30 p.m., almost 3 hours after Helen got off that elevator, her husband Giannis sat outside the Met in his van. Giannis often picked his wife up to drive her home because walking at night in New York City in 1980 could be dangerous. Giannis watched the dancers, musicians, and employees filing out of the Met, but he didn't see Helen. So he figured maybe she was still talking to one of her friends in the dressing room. But when it got to be midnight and Helen still had not come outside, Giannis thought maybe she was getting a ride home with someone else and she had just forgotten to let him know. So he hopped out of his van, went to the nearest payphone, and called home. But there was no answer. So Giannis figured there just must have been some miscommunication between him and his wife, and he headed home. A few minutes later, Giannis walked into his and Helen's apartment, and it was empty. Giannis thought it was a bit strange Helen wasn't home yet, even if she did get a ride home with someone else. But he figured maybe they had grabbed a drink before heading this way. Then he heard a knock at the door. This had to be Helen, and she must have forgotten her key or something. Giannis went to the front door and opened it up, and suddenly he started to get worried. Because a nervous-looking man stood at the door with Helen's violin case in his hands. He said that he and some of the other musicians who played with Helen were really freaked out because Helen had left the orchestra pit during the first intermission and she never came back. He said a group of people had called the apartment and searched for Helen after the show, but they couldn't find her anywhere. Janis took Helen's violin case and he closed his eyes like he was fighting back tears. He knew his wife would never just leave her violin behind somewhere, not even at the Met. In a flat, quiet voice, Janis thanked the man for coming by. Then he closed the door, put down Helen's violin case, and went to the phone and called the police. In the early morning of July 24th, several hours after Janis called the police, Detective Jerry Giorgio of the NYPD walked into the lobby of the Met. The two officers who had arrived first greeted him and showed him the photo they had of Helen Hagnes. Detective Giorgio looked at the photo and heard the lobby doors open behind him. He turned and saw a frantic-looking young woman running in. Giorgio held up his hand to try to get her to slow down and asked if she was okay. She introduced herself and said she was a ballerina in the performance. She had heard about Helen going missing from one of her friends, and she thought she might be able to help, because she was pretty sure she was one of the last people who had seen Helen. The ballerina said that she and Helen happened to be on the backstage elevator together during the first intermission, and Helen had mentioned she was on her way to visit with Panov. Detective Giorgio asked who Panov was. The ballerina smiled and said Valery Panov was one of the most famous male ballet dancers in the whole world. Giorgio thanked her and said her information was a huge help. He got the ballerina's information and told her he would contact her if he needed anything else. As the ballerina walked away, Giorgio handed the photo of Helen back to the two officers and told them to wait there in case anyone else showed up. Then he walked further into the grand lobby of the Met, and the design of the place was like nothing he had ever seen. The huge staircases leading to the higher floors almost looked like they led to nowhere and just disappeared into the darkness. Giorgio had just started to search the lobby when a security guard walked in and introduced himself. His boss had told him to come down and help the police if they needed it. Giorgio was relieved. He said he didn't want to waste any time. He needed a full tour of the opera house. But at this, the security guard busted out laughing. He said that would be impossible. The building was massive, with 6 stories above ground and 3 basements below. And there were so many hallways and hidden rooms that navigating the Met was like walking through a maze. Giorgio said they would get as many cops as they needed to comb through the whole place, but in the meantime, he at least wanted a tour of the backstage area where Helen would have gone during intermission. So the security guard led Giorgio into the theater, up onto the stage, and into the wings. Giorgio looked around the expansive backstage area, and he saw giant set pieces, black curtains hanging everywhere, multiple exits, and an elevator. Then he walked down a stairwell and found himself in a vast, dimly lit basement that made him feel like he was in a horror movie. Giorgio saw cases for double bass instruments that were bigger than him leaned up against the wall. And scattered throughout the basement, he saw old set pieces from past performances and large wooden crates filled with costumes and props. Giorgio started to feel overwhelmed. He thought if the worst had happened, if Helen was dead, her body could be in a crate or an instrument case or in one of the countless dark corners, hiding just out of view. At around 8 a.m., after hours of exploring the depths of the Met, Detective Giorgio went back to the lobby and checked in with the other 2 officers who were still there. He was about to find a phone to call the police station to get more help when a maintenance worker ran inside, and this guy looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Giorgio asked him what was wrong, and the worker said he'd just gone up to the roof of the building to turn on one of the ventilation fans, and while he was up there, he found a pair of women's black shoes, like the ones he'd seen the women in the orchestra wear. Detective Giorgio's heart sank. Helen had disappeared in the middle of a performance, and now her shoes might have been found on the roof. And Giorgio's first thought was that Helen went up there, jumped off the building, taking her own life. Giorgio and the other officers followed the maintenance worker to a service elevator, and they traveled up to the roof in complete silence. The elevator stopped, the doors opened, and Giorgio had to squint as the daylight hit his eyes. The maintenance worker stepped out of the elevator and showed the police the pair of black shoes. Then Giorgio walked to the edge of the building and looked down, but there was nothing on the ground that looked out of the ordinary. So the officers spread out and searched the roof for any additional clues, and within a few minutes, Detective Giorgio heard one of them shout, "Oh my God!" Giorgio whipped around and saw an officer standing by this enormous metal fan, looking through the wide space between two of the blades down into the ventilation shaft. Giorgio joined him and leaned over to look into the shaft as well, and he thought he saw something about 30 feet below, but it was a little dark down there, and he couldn't tell what it was. It took a few seconds for Giorgio's eyes to adjust, but slowly, everything came into focus. There at the bottom, he saw the nude, bloody body of a woman. Shortly after, Detective Giorgio looked down the ventilation shaft and saw the woman's body. An NYPD homicide detective named Mike Struck finished his morning run in Central Park and called into the station to check in for the day. Dispatch told him not to even bother coming into the office. Instead, they said, go straight to the Metropolitan Opera House. Struck rushed home, got cleaned up and changed, and then raced down to the Met. The place was now buzzing with employees and police. And amid the crowd, Detective Struck was happy to see Detective Giorgio. The two men enjoyed working together, and they made a good team. Giorgio was calm and almost fatherly, while Struck was blunt and always seemed like he was moving 100 miles an hour. Giorgio filled Struck in on everything police had found that morning. They had found Helen Hagness's body in a large maintenance tunnel on the 3rd floor. It looked like she had fallen to her death through the ventilation shaft from the roof, but Giorgio was sure someone had pushed her, because her hands and feet had been bound with rope and there was a gag stuffed in her mouth. Giorgio thought the attack could have been sexual, but he had no idea if it was random or if somebody had targeted Helen. Then Struck went to go take Polaroids of Helen's body, and he worked with crime scene technicians as they searched for clues. In addition to a pink bra, they found a pair of black pants, a black shirt, and a blue flower, all near the body. Later that day, several hours after the discovery of Helen's body, the NYPD had set up a fully operational command post inside the offices of the Opera House, and teams of detectives, uniformed police, and forensics technicians scoured the building for more evidence. Not long after the command center got set up, Detective Struck left his and Giorgio's makeshift office, walked into the office of one of the Met's operations managers, and asked how many employees the Met had. But when the manager answered more than 800, all Struck could do was laugh. That was an impossible number of people to interview. Still, he asked the manager for a list of all of those employees, as well as a separate list of the people who were actually working or performing at the Opera House when Helen had disappeared from the orchestra pit. When Struck returned to his office, he found a crime scene technician waiting for him. The tech told Struck they were able to lift a pristine palm print off the outside of that ventilation shaft on the roof. In fact, the print was so good, the tech worried that some careless police officer or other investigator had touched the ventilation shaft that morning and made the print. Struck thanked the tech for the update and asked him to report back as soon as he knew anything, even if it was just to say that a cop had messed up and left that print. Then Struck sat down at what was now his desk, he grabbed his phone, and called Helen's husband, Giannis, and told him he needed to come in to the Met. Detectives Struck and Giorgio sat in their office, reviewing their notes while they waited for their first suspect. Forensics officers and the medical examiner had not found any indication of sexual assault, which made them think it was possible that Helen's murder was actually just staged to look like a sexual assault. And they thought maybe Giannis had met with Helen at some point during the intermission. Then they fought, and he took her up to the roof of the building, where he tied her up and killed her. As the two detectives theorized and talked through the case, the door opened and an officer led Giannis in. Giannis actually stumbled into the room and then collapsed into a chair across from the two detectives. Struck and Giorgio could tell Giannis was drunk just from the smell. And even if they couldn't tell from the smell, the open bottle of Jack Daniels in his hand made it pretty clear. This was a new one for both detectives. They had never seen someone show up to a police interview with a bottle of whiskey. But regardless, the detectives jumped right into the questions. They asked Giannis about his and his wife's relationship. Giannis was slurring his words, but he did manage to tell them that he loved his wife, and he had gone to the Met to pick her up and drive her home, but she had never showed up. Struck and Giorgio listened, but they knew that almost nothing Giannis said in his current state would ever hold up in court. I mean, the guy was drunk. So they told him they would have an officer drive him home, and after he'd gotten some rest, they would follow up with him if they needed to. Later that afternoon, Struck and Giorgio were sitting in the theater when the famous Russian dancer Panov and his interpreter walked in. Panov, according to that ballerina that Giorgio had met that morning, may have been the last person who'd seen Helen alive. Panov took a seat near the detectives and asked how he could help. Then, through his interpreter, he said he did know a musician had gone missing at the Met, but he didn't know anything more than that. Giorgio handed Panov a picture of Helen and said she was the missing musician, and the last time anyone had seen her, she was on her way to meet Panov. Panov looked down at the picture and then said something in Russian. The interpreter then told the detectives that Panov did not know this woman, and she never came to visit him that night, and he had no idea she was even planning to. Then Panov spoke for himself. He explained in broken English that at least 50 people came to visit him every night. It was nothing unusual for audience members or other artists to flood his dressing room. And he tried to meet as many people as he could and be as gracious as he could because he knew that a lot of people had helped him become a ballet star. Struck asked him where he was at the time Helen disappeared during the first intermission. Panov said he had rushed to his dressing room to get changed and then went into the audience. He wasn't in the second part of the ballet, but his wife was, and he loved watching her dance. The detectives knew it would be easy to confirm this if it was true. Audience members and the crew would definitely have noticed one of the most famous dancers in the world walking amongst the crowd. So the detectives told both men they could go. Panov said he was sorry about what had happened to the musician, and then he and his interpreter headed backstage. It was late in the day at this point, and everyone working at the Met was getting ready for that evening's performance. So Giorgio and Struck decided to head home and regroup in the morning. The next day, the detectives walked into the Met lobby and greeted the young ballerina who had flagged down Giorgio the day before to say she had ridden on the backstage elevator with Helen. As far as the detectives knew, she may have been the last person to see Helen alive, other than the killer. So they had asked her to come back to see if maybe she could give them a clearer picture of Helen's movements that night. The detectives led the ballerina to their office, and she sat down across from them. She said she was glad they called her because she had remembered something. When she was in the elevator with Helen, there was a man that was there with them. He had told Helen that Panov's dressing room was on the 3rd floor, and this man was still with Helen when the ballerina got off the elevator. Giorgio and Struck leaned forward. This was huge. It meant that that man on the elevator was either the last witness to see Helen alive, or he was the killer. Struck asked the ballerina if she could describe what this man in the elevator looked like. The ballerina squinted her eyes like she was trying to remember, but she shook her head and apologized. She knew he was a man, but that was about it. Detective Giorgio leaned over to Struck and whispered something in his ear, and Struck nodded in agreement. Then Giorgio turned to the ballerina and said he knew this was going to sound strange, but sometimes the police used a hypnotist to help witnesses remember things in more detail. So Giorgio wanted to know if the ballerina would agree to be hypnotized, and the ballerina said yes. So that afternoon, a hypnotist dimmed the lights in the office and then took a seat across from the ballerina. At the same time, Giorgio and Struck lingered in the corner, and an NYPD sketch artist sat a few feet away, holding his pencil and a sketchbook. The hypnotist told the ballerina to close her eyes and listen only to his voice. And slowly, the hypnotist used his soothing voice and his words to draw the ballerina deeper and deeper into a state of relaxation, until finally she was in a trance. Once she was, the hypnotist asked the ballerina to turn back the clock in her mind to the moment that Helen had stepped on the elevator with her. He asked the ballerina to look closely at the elevator and the man who was there, and to describe him as best as she could. The ballerina concentrated, and she began to speak, describing this man. She said he looked like he was between 20 and 25 years old. He was slightly overweight, had a large nose, brown hair, and bright red lips. And as the ballerina gave these details, the sketch artist began to draw. A few minutes later, the hypnotist gently brought the ballerina out of her trance and turned the lights back on. Police quickly made copies of the sketch and circulated it among the Met's employees. And while they were hopeful, there was the reality that a lot of people could fit the description of a young, slightly overweight guy with brown hair. But later that day, a Met employee walked into the detective's office and told them there was someone they needed to talk to right away. It was a stagehand named Vincent Donahue. Struck asked if Vincent fit the description of the man the sketch artist had drawn. The employee said he did, at least a few days ago, but on the night following Helen's murder, Vincent had showed up to work and he had completely shaved off his brown hair and he had a large scratch on his face. That afternoon, Vincent Donahue took a seat inside the detective's office and he looked annoyed. He said he needed this to be fast because he had a lot of work to do before the performance that night. Giorgio smiled and said he understood, but first he said he had to ask where did that nasty scratch on his face come from. Vincent said he and his girlfriend had gotten into a pretty bad fight a couple of nights ago and his girlfriend used her fingernails when she got angry. Detective Struck quickly jumped in and asked why Vincent had shaved his head. Vincent laughed and said during the argument with his girlfriend where she scratched him, she had said the only good thing about him was his hair. So after she had stormed out of the room, he had shaved his hair off just out of spite. Struck had a look on his face like this seemed totally ridiculous, and Vincent could tell. So Vincent quickly said, "Really, this is the truth." Then he told the detectives he didn't have anything to do with that musician getting killed. And he said instead of wasting time talking to him, they needed to talk to a guy named Craig Crimmins. Vincent said Craig was also a stagehand and he had missed a major cue to move scenery during the second act of the performance on the night Helen died. He had just left his backstage post and disappeared. Now, Struck thought Vincent could still be lying. However, the idea that a stagehand went missing around the same time that Helen went missing was suspicious. So Struck told Vincent he could leave and go back to work, but they might need him again. And as soon as Vincent left the office, Struck and Giorgio sent an officer to track down the stagehand, Craig Crimmins. When Craig stepped into Struck and Giorgio's office, he looked exhausted. Giorgio asked Craig to take a seat, and then once he handed him a photo of Helen and asked Craig if he knew her. Craig glanced at the picture and said he only recognized her from what he had seen in the news. He'd never met her or talked to her. She was a musician, and he didn't really interact with the musicians. Struck just stared at Craig while he spoke. He was young and had brown hair, just like the ballerina's description. So Struck asked if Craig had ridden the backstage elevator at all on the night Helen died. But Craig just shook his head. He said he'd been at his spot backstage the whole performance. Struck leaned across the desk and said if that was true, then why had his colleagues claimed that Craig had been absent from backstage during an important cue that night, specifically during the second act? Craig's face flushed and he stared down at the floor. He said he did miss a cue that night, but he didn't leave backstage. He was embarrassed to admit it to the cops, but he had shown up to work that night drunk and fallen asleep at his post. He told the detectives that another stagehand who worked right beside him backstage had seen him and could back him up that he was telling the truth. Struck and Giorgio questioned Craig a bit longer, and then they let him go. They quickly found the other stagehand Craig had mentioned, and this guy said Craig was telling the truth. He had passed out backstage and basically slept through part of the performance. With Craig's alibi checking out, the detectives still believed they had viable suspects among the other people they had talked to. But they still had hundreds more people to interview, and they still hadn't heard anything about the one major piece of forensic evidence that had been found, the fresh palm print that had been pulled from the ventilation shaft on the roof. So the detectives felt like if they didn't quickly find some new evidence, they were going to be stuck with an overwhelmingly massive suspect pool. 6 days after Helen's murder, on July 29, 1980, her memorial service was held at a New York City church. The church was filled with friends, family, and countless people from the Met. One of Helen's violinist friends performed at the service in her honor. In the 2 weeks following Helen's funeral, Detectives Struck and Giorgio continued their work at the Met, but the Opera House had grown oddly quiet. The ballet had finished its run of performances, and the next show had not opened yet. So the detectives found themselves wandering through the nearly empty, huge building, trying to find anything that they might have missed. But nothing came of those additional searches, and even after weeks of combing through the place, they still felt like there were corners of the Met that remained hidden. But just at the point when the detectives worried their case was about to go cold, Strzok got a call from an excited forensics technician. The tech said he could not believe it, but that nearly perfect palm print found on the ventilation shaft did not belong to a careless police officer or investigator like the forensics team had originally suspected. And it was a relatively fresh print, so it could belong to the killer. When Detective Strzok hung up, he told Giorgio what he just learned, and Giorgio got excited. This palm print was not a smoking gun just yet, but it definitely could be. It was very difficult to access the roof of the Met, so the detectives believed the print had to belong to somebody who worked or performed there, or someone who came by fairly often to visit a family member who worked there. Over the next several days, Opera House employees met with the police in groups of 2s and 3s, and they allowed officers to take their palm prints. And only one of them seemed really nervous about it when asked to give their print, and this was somebody Strzok and Giorgio had already spoken to. This person broke out into a sweat and said that they were uncomfortable with this whole situation. But Detective Giorgio smiled softly, and in his best fatherly voice, he said providing a print was the best way for police to cross them off the list and allow them to put all this behind them. So ultimately, this person agreed and gave their palm print. And when testing on that print came back, Detectives Giorgio and Strzok saw that it was a perfect match to the one found on the roof. And they believed they had found Helen's killer. Based on the palm print, evidence from the scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helen Hagnes on the night of July 23, 1980. The killer saw Helen walking down a hallway on the 3rd floor during the first intermission of the ballet, and they quickly walked down the hall and grabbed her arm. Helen turned around and didn't understand what was happening, but the killer just pulled out a hammer and pushed her into a stairwell. The killer dragged Helen down all the stairs to one of the sub-basements, and then once there, he demanded she take off her clothes. And Helen did. The killer attempted to rape Helen, but they couldn't. And so out of frustration, they demanded Helen put her clothes back on, and then they grabbed her by the arm, and still with the hammer in hand, they led her all the way upstairs to the roof. Once on the roof, the killer once again made Helen get undressed. Except this time, the killer also bound her wrists and her ankles, and they also gagged her. But Helen fought back, and at some point during the struggle, the killer knew they were running out of time. And so out of frustration and panic and anger and embarrassment, they scooped up Helen and they walked over to the air conditioning vent and they placed her on the ledge. And then, as Helen desperately tried to push past them and get back on the roof, the killer just raised up their leg, placed their foot on her side, and they pushed her into the vent. Helen would fall 6 stories to her death. And after she was dead, the killer reached down, scooped up her clothes, and threw them into the vent after her. After that, the killer ran to the door, believing they had disposed of all the evidence. Except they hadn't. They had accidentally left Helen's shoes up on the roof. The killer flew down the stairs all the way to the theater and ran backstage. However, by the time they got there, they were out of time. The intermission was over and the ballet had started again, meaning the killer had missed a very important cue. Craig Crimmins, the stagehand who claimed to have shown up drunk and fallen asleep backstage, killed Helen Hagnes. On the night of the murder, Craig was in fact the man on the elevator with Helen and the young ballerina. And when Helen asked about where Panov's dressing room was, Craig had chimed in and said it was on the 3rd floor. But that was a lie. He was simply trying to trap her. And so when Helen got off the elevator on the 3rd floor, Craig followed her down the hallway, grabbed her, and brought her to the basement, intending to rape her. However, he could not perform sexually, and so in his rage and humiliation, he dragged her up to the roof where he would kill her. Craig did resemble the sketch from the ballerina's hypnosis session. However, it was Craig's palm print on the air conditioning vent that made detectives turn their focus on him. And soon after the detectives discovered Craig's print matched the one on the ventilation shaft, they learned that the other stagehand who said he saw Craig sleeping backstage was lying for his coworker. But he thought Craig had asked him to lie for him just to cover up the fact that he had left backstage and missed an important cue. Craig Crimmins was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. He went on to serve 40 years in prison and was paroled in August of 2021. In 1956, the SS Andrea Doria, which was a beautiful ocean liner, was considered to be Italy's largest, fastest, and safest ship. But those things would not be what this ship was remembered for. On July 25th of that year, the ship was sailing towards the east coast of the United States when it ran into some very heavy fog. And so, following procedure, the captain slowed the vessel down and turned on their fog whistle. A little while later, another vessel, the Swedish ocean liner called the SS Stockholm, entered the fog as well, but they were unaware of Andrea Doria's position. Now, both vessels were using radar, but unfortunately, both vessels misinterpreted what they were seeing, and so neither of them communicated with the other as they careened towards each other. When visual contact was finally made between the two ships, it was too late. A collision was imminent. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the bow of the Stockholm plowed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria, penetrating over 40 feet inside the ship before coming back out again. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria and 5 people on the Stockholm. When the story broke, every major news outlet around the world picked it up, including ABC News in the United States. And the news correspondent that they chose to cover this story was a man named Edward Morgan. And unbeknownst to his coworkers, his 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was on board the Andrea Doria. And just before he went on, he was informed that she was amongst the missing and presumed dead, and there was virtually nothing he could do but wait for more information. And so despite his incredible burden, Edward still went on the air and reported the story without ever losing his composure and without ever mentioning his daughter. But after he got off the air, another story began to develop about the crash. Apparently, a girl who was asleep in one of the rooms on the Andrea Doria that experienced a direct hit from the Stockholm woke up after the crash and didn't know where she was, and she began yelling out for her mother. Meanwhile, a man on board the Stockholm heard the girl's cries, and he ran towards the front of the Stockholm, which is where he heard these cries coming from, and when he got up there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Perched on the destroyed bow of the Stockholm was a bed, and on that bed was a relatively unhurt 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. It would turn out when the Stockholm penetrated into the Andrea Doria, the bow of the Stockholm scooped the bed Linda Morgan was on up and kind of dragged her into the ship, and then when it retracted out of the Andrea Doria, it brought that bed and Linda Morgan with it. When Edward Morgan found out that his daughter was the so-called miracle girl, he was overcome with emotions, and he would go back on the air, and this time he would talk about his daughter and her incredible survival story, and he would also talk about how hard it was to deliver the news when it was about someone he loved. Linda would make a full physical recovery. She only suffered from a broken arm, but she would suffer enormously from survivor's guilt, as her stepfather and her half-sister were both killed in the crash. Our next story is called One for the Road. Late on the night of Friday, September 18th, 2015, a 45-year-old man named Lattori Barman stumbled down a pitch-black street in a small village in central India. Lattori was stumbling because he was very, very drunk. He and his wife had spent most of the night together out at this local fair, having loads to drink and partying, and then at some point his wife had actually broken off and gone to her parents' house in another village, but Lattori had decided to stay out and keep the fun rolling. And so once she was gone, Lattori had gone to a liquor store and had more to drink there, and then now he had finally decided he had had enough, he was extremely intoxicated, and he just wanted to get back home. And so as Lattori stumbled down this road, he could really only see maybe a foot in front of him. Not only because he was so drunk, but also because the streets in his village did not have lights, and so it was totally dark. However, this wasn't unusual for Lattori. I mean, this is where he lived. He'd walked the street many, many times and knew how to navigate without any lighting. And so he just continued walking along, business as usual. But what did strike him as odd is that, late at night here, as he's making his way home, he thought it was weird that there was a lot of people out on the road. He couldn't really see them because, again, there's no lighting, but he could definitely hear them. Like there was people sort of all over the place. And he also sort of in his intoxicated state saw some lights that, maybe were vehicles sort of moving around. So there was like more activity on this road than usual. But at the same time, like this is a main road and sometimes there's lots of people and cars on it, even late at night. So this didn't really strike him as odd enough to stop and investigate. He just kept on walking towards his house. But as he's walking through with all this commotion all around him, at some point he goes to step, but instead of his foot striking the ground again, there's nothing there. And suddenly he feels himself falling and he smashes into the ground, and now truly it's pitch black. He can't see anything and he blacks out. The following morning, a group of villagers were walking down the same street that Latore had been on the night before, and as they were walking, now in broad daylight, they looked up ahead and they noticed something odd right in the middle of the street. And at first they had no idea what it was, and so they walked closer to it to get a better look. And as they walked up on this thing, they instantly understood what it was, and they screamed and ran to tell authorities. It would turn out the reason Latore was hearing and seeing all these people and, vehicles on the street the night before, which seemed sort of out of place, was because there was actually a construction crew repairing potholes in that road. This road was known for being very dangerous because of these deep potholes. And Latore, as he was stumbling along, accidentally fell into one of these deep potholes, smashed the ground, and was knocked unconscious. And because this worksite was so chaotic and there was all this, movement and there was bad lighting, none of the crew saw Latore fall in. And Latore, even after, coming to inside the hole, was too drunk to get out of the hole. And so at some point that night, the construction crew reached the pothole that Latore was in. They didn't see him, and they poured molten tar into the hole and then rolled over it with a roller, all with Latore inside the hole. And so after they were done and moved on to the next pothole, Latore in his final moments tried to kind of pull himself out of this tar, but he only managed to get his hand up and out of the tar. And so the next day, the group of villagers that walked down the road, what did they see? They saw Latore's hand poking out of the ground. Latore's body was removed from the street and he was given a proper burial. There were 2 construction workers who were on duty on the night of Latore's death who were ultimately arrested and charged with culpable homicide. As for Latore's family, authorities would give them a compensation payment for Latore's death, but it was only worth approximately $760. The next and final story of today's episode is called Her Face. One evening in September of 1885, a young woman named Mary stepped out of the backseat of a carriage onto a dirt road in rural England. She had traveled 100 miles from London to the countryside because her husband's aunt had invited her to come visit. Standing on the dirt road, Mary looked up at the big country house, then she grabbed her suitcase and walked up to the front door and knocked. Then, a moment later, the aunt's maid opened the door. She greeted Mary and took her suitcase and brought the suitcase to the guest room, while Mary headed straight down the hallway to her aunt's bedroom. When she got there, Mary gently knocked on the door and then opened it up. And when she looked inside, she saw the aunt lying in bed, and, the aunt looked up and saw Mary and she smiled, but she was very old and very frail, not doing too well physically. And, that's part of the reason Mary was here, to just kind of see her while she still could. But the aunt looked up and saw Mary and recognized her, and so she smiled, and Mary came in and sat down next to her, and for a couple of minutes, the 2 women just had some small talk. Mary talked about her journey from London to, the countryside where she was now, and, the aunt talked about what she was up to. It was all just kind of, pleasantries. But at some point, the aunt kind of stopped and looked up at Mary, and she had this obvious look of pity on her face. And Mary immediately picked up on it, and she's kind of looking back at the aunt, wondering what's going on here. And then the aunt just says to Mary, "Really, how are you holding up?" And immediately, Mary, when she heard this, she felt this knot in her throat, and she had to fight back tears. She knew exactly what the aunt was talking about. So even though Mary was a young woman, she was already a widow. Her husband had died in an accident about 2 years earlier, and it had sent Mary into this spiraling deep depression. She was still completely grieving the loss of her husband. He had been the love of her life. And, her extended family and her husband's extended family were all well aware of how badly Mary had been doing. And so they had been extending her invitations constantly to come visit and basically just not be alone. I mean, that was the reason really why her husband's aunt had invited her here, is because she knew Mary likely wasn't doing well. Now, to Mary, this was nice in a way. I mean, she felt very comforted by the family members, and it did seem like people genuinely cared about her. But at the same time, she started to get the impression from basically everybody in her and her husband's family that they kind of expected her to, grieve this loss, but ultimately move on. Like, find somebody else, basically. You're young, like, get remarried, start a new life. But to Mary, she just wanted to be like, no, I'm never gonna find anyone like my husband. He was the love of my life and no one will ever match him, ever. Like, I'm done. I probably will never get married again. Like, he was it for me. And so at that moment, Mary really just wanted to end this conversation with her husband's aunt. Like, she didn't want to get into how she was feeling about her husband because it was bad. She felt bad. But instead of saying that to her husband's aunt, she just said, you know what, I'm okay, I'm just totally exhausted from travel, and I'm gonna go to bed. The aunt nodded and told Mary that, we'll have plenty of time to visit tomorrow, so go get some sleep. And so the two women hugged, and then Mary got up, she left the bedroom, headed to the guest room, she found her suitcase, got on some pajamas, and then crawled into bed. But a few hours later, in the middle of the night, Mary suddenly bolted upright in her bed. She was sweating, she was shaking, she was totally disoriented. It took her a few minutes to even remember where she was. But then finally, when she did and she realized she was safe, she realized she had just had this awful, visceral nightmare that she really couldn't even make sense of. In this nightmare, she was looking out at this huge open field. It's nighttime, and there's nothing but this field. But off in the distance, there was this broken down small shed. It was just sitting there conspicuously right in the middle of this field. And even though Mary was terrified of the shed, she felt this overwhelming urge to go to the shed and investigate. And so it's like with every step as she walked through this field closer and closer to the shed, her fear was rising. And then finally, when she got close to the shed, she began to hear what sounded like somebody moaning inside of the structure. And so now she's really scared, but she keeps walking towards the shed, and then she's right outside. She can't see into the shed, but she can hear the moaning, and she sees her hand just come down and fling the door open, almost like she didn't want to, but her body's acting on autopilot. And then she looks into the shed, and there's this figure tucked into the corner, kind of in the shadows, and it's the thing making these moaning sounds. And it turns, and Mary sees it's this woman, this emaciated, destroyed-looking woman, but her face is the same face as Mary's dead husband. And as soon as she saw that, it jolted her awake. And so that's where she was, sitting in her bedroom, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. And so after 15 or 20 minutes of Mary trying and failing to fall back asleep because of this horrible nightmare, Mary finally says, you know what, I'm just gonna go outside, clear my head, go for a walk. I know it's the middle of the night, whatever. I'll bring some brandy along and sip that to calm my nerves and just kind of walk around until I'm calm, and then I'll go back to sleep. So she hopped out of bed, she grabbed her flask of brandy, grabbed her jacket, got her shoes on, and walked out the front door. About 15 minutes later, Mary was walking up a hill with the moonlight casting down on her. She was sipping her brandy as she went and was already beginning to calm down. Now, Mary was used to living in the city, in London, and so being out here in the countryside was so different. It was so beautiful and peaceful and spaced out that she had kind of just begun walking and not stopped. I mean, she originally thought she would just stay on the aunt's property, but already she was well beyond the property lines and was basically just out exploring in the middle of the night, and she was having a nice time. And so up the hill Mary goes. Now, remember, Mary has never been to this area. This is basically an all new place. She has no idea what's over here. And she goes up this hill, she crests the top, and she gets a look at what's up there for the first time. And when she sees what's up there, she freezes. She's looking out at this huge field, basically in all directions. And in the center of this field, maybe a couple hundred yards away, is a single small structure, a broken down wooden shed that looks nearly identical to the shed she had just seen in her nightmare. And as soon as she saw that, she's terrified because she knows it's the same one or it's eerily similar. But worse than that, when she saw it, despite her own fears and trepidations about being up here, she felt herself moving towards the shed. It was like her body went into autopilot the same way it did in her dream. It was like she had to go to the shed, even though everything inside of her logically is saying, don't go. But into the field she goes. She deviates off the path and just starts walking towards the shed. Her heart is beating like mad, and as she's getting closer and closer, she even begins to hear moaning sounds coming from the shed. It's like she's living out the nightmare in real life. She can't make sense of it. She wants to go back the other way, but she can't stop herself. She's just going towards the shed. And then finally she reaches the shed, and now for sure she can hear moaning coming from in this building. And she sees her hand reach down, and she flings open the shed, and she looks in, and sure enough, there is this dark figure tucked in the corner, clearly moaning, like this is her nightmare in real life. But when the person inside the shed turned to look at Mary, it was a woman, but they didn't have her dead husband's face. Instead, it was a woman who practically looked like she was dead or close to death. She obviously needed help. Now, at this point, Mary was kind of relieved. I mean, this whole situation is terrifying, but she was expecting to, somehow see her dead husband's face on this person in the shed. And so when it wasn't, and it was just like a normal person, albeit in a very strange set of circumstances, it was a relief. But now Mary didn't know what to do. It's like she's standing there looking at this woman, having no idea what to do. She doesn't understand how she could have dreamed this and now basically lived it too. Like nothing's adding up. But again, it was like her body continued to operate in this autopilot mode. She suddenly had this really intense desire to go into the shed and help this woman. She didn't know who she was. This is a total stranger in the middle of a field in a shed who's moaning and looks terrible. She has no idea what's going on, but in she goes. And she sits down next to this woman who's now kind of eyeing Mary, like, what are you doing in here with me? And Mary says to her, like, hey, what's going on? How'd you get here? What's wrong? Like, what's happening? But the woman, it was clear she wanted to respond to Mary and, tell her what was going on, but, she was too weak. It was like she really was on death's door here. And Mary could clearly see that. Like, she didn't need to be told this woman is in a very bad way here. Now, Mary knew what needed to happen is this woman needs to get to a hospital. But they were nowhere near a hospital, and this woman clearly can't get up and walk. And Mary's thinking, I'm not strong enough to carry this woman to the hospital. Like, what am I gonna do? And, Mary's thinking, maybe if I just run and get help and they can come back here. But she's looking at this woman thinking, I don't know if she'll survive. She's probably gonna die soon. Like, this is gonna happen now. And so Mary, again, sort of in this weird autopilot mode, decides, you know what? I'm gonna stay right here with this woman. She can't even talk. She can't tell me what's going on, but I am gonna be here with her. I'm gonna be present with her. And if she dies, I'll be here to support her. And so Mary just made herself comfortable. She took her jacket off. She put it over this woman. And then she began letting this woman sip from her brandy flask to, maybe kind of ease the pain. And all night, the two women just kind of sat there and laid together. When the sun finally rose the next morning, Mary looked over at the woman and saw she was still alive. And in fact, if anything, she seemed like her condition had maybe improved slightly. She seemed maybe a little bit more comfortable. Maybe that was from all the brandy. Who knows? But the woman seemed like she had stabilized a little bit. Still couldn't talk or really tell Mary anything, but she seemed to be doing a little bit better. And so Mary's thinking, okay, the sun's up now. Now I can run out, get help, and get this woman the care that she needs. But before Mary could even do that, she began hearing a stomping sound somewhere outside of the shed, and she realized it was a horse approaching. And so Mary, she bolts out of the shed and she looks over towards the road, and there's a horse pulling a covered wagon going right by, and Mary screams and yells and says she needs help, and a man pops his head out of the wagon and says what's going on, and Mary runs over to him and explains this weird situation, how there's this strange woman over here and she's clearly dying, she needs our help, and the man agreed to help. And so he went with Mary to the shed, he picked the woman up, he put her inside of his wagon, and then the three of them together in this wagon drove to Mary's husband's aunt's house. When they got there, the man carried the strange woman inside of the aunt's house, and then Mary told the aunt's maid to go call for the town doctor, and so she said she would. And so at this point, Mary was actually completely relieved. I mean, this was kind of a wild, very unexpected night. I mean, she doesn't even know who this woman is, but she's definitely happy that she's getting, some level of care here. But Mary sort of felt like her role in this was kind of diminished now. She's gotten the woman here and she's feeling so tired and weak from being up all night. And so Mary decided she would just take a nap. I mean, she had been up all night with this woman. She was exhausted. So into her bedroom she went, she climbed into bed, and as she's laying there, she realized she wasn't just tired, she actually felt kind of sick, like ill. And over the next few hours, as she kind of tossed and turned in her bed, not really able to sleep, she would develop this horrible fever. And this fever would just get worse and worse and worse, and Mary would become bedridden dealing with this mystery illness for weeks, just drifting in and out of consciousness the whole time. It was October by the time Mary's fever finally broke. And on the day that it did, when Mary opened her eyes in this bed, she was clear-headed for the first time. I mean, really, it had been a very rough stretch of a few weeks. And so she's looking around the room, kind of taking stock of her environment, and she sees there's this strange person sitting in a chair in the corner. And her immediate reaction is, oh, this must be like a nurse or a doctor or somebody here that's kind of overseeing me. Mary was aware she had been very sick for several weeks and there were people in and out of the room, but she looked back at this person and realized she actually knew who it was. It was the woman she had rescued from the shed on the night she got sick. It was that woman. But now she wasn't sickly and dying. The woman looked completely healthy and happy, and she was smiling ear to ear at Mary. Like, this didn't make any sense. Like, what's going on here? And also, Mary just couldn't help but think, like, wait a minute, why is this woman still here? It has been weeks since I rescued her from the shed. Why is she still here? Like, nothing's adding up. But before Mary could ask any questions, this woman, who clearly was super excited to see that Mary was now fully awake and attentive, this woman just starts talking a mile a minute. Like she had been waiting to dump all this information on Mary as soon as she was well. Like clearly this woman has been waiting diligently for her chance to tell her story. And the story that she dumped on Mary at her first chance, like this day, was incredible. The woman told her that a couple of years earlier, she had boarded the ship in England that was bound for Brazil. But about 5 days into their journey, while they're out on the open sea, the ship caught fire. This horrible fire, everyone's trying to evacuate, and this woman said she was in her bedroom, asleep. She didn't even know what was happening. And while she's laying there and the ship is catching fire and beginning to sink, this stranger comes barreling into the room, literally wakes her up, scoops her up, and takes her to the top deck and gets her into a lifeboat right as the ship sinks. I mean, this stranger completely saved this woman's life. And so this woman, the stranger who had saved her, and a handful of other lucky people who had made it onto this lifeboat just began rowing in a single direction, hoping they'd find land. And luckily they did. They found this deserted island. And so they landed there, and for a year, this woman and the stranger and those few people subsisted on this island, barely clinging to life, praying for rescue. And amazingly, after a year of being shipwrecked, they flagged down a ship that did rescue them and brought them to England. However, when they actually got to England, things weren't that good. The stranger who had saved this woman had basically lost his mind from living on this island, not expecting to be rescued. Even though they got rescued, it was like he wasn't coherent anymore. He had lost it. Not to mention he was really ill from the way they were living on this island, scavenging things that weren't necessarily edible, but just to survive, they were eating whatever they could. I mean, it was a very rough lifestyle. And this man, he just hadn't really handled it well. And so he got thrown in a hospital and placed in a particular ward for people that were mentally unwell, and he was basically forgotten about. However, the woman would tell Mary that, when this happened, she felt awful because she felt like this stranger had saved her life and she kind of owed him a debt. And so she decided it would be her mission to find the stranger's family and let them know where he was. And so the woman said she did some research and she figured out where one of his relatives lived. It was really far away on the other side of England. And so she spent all her money, using every vehicle she possibly could, every ride she could take, getting as close to this location as she possibly could. And then when she ran out of money, she just kept on walking towards this destination. And she kept going until she literally ran out of food and water, but she wasn't quite there yet. She knew she was getting close and she's just walking and she's basically falling apart, so hell-bent on finding this family member for this stranger, but she can't quite make it. She can't quite get to the family member's house. And that's when she finds this shed out in the middle of the field where she just collapses, thinking, okay, this is where I'm gonna die. And so back in the guest room, Mary is listening to this woman tell this unbelievable story, and at some point the woman just kind of stops when she gets to the shed scene. And Mary's looking at her like, I don't really understand where you're going with this. I don't understand why you're here telling me this. And the woman, she just starts to laugh, like this joyous laughter, just nonstop laughter. And then she goes, don't you get it? And then seconds later, Mary hears footsteps and a man walks into the bedroom, and it's Mary's husband. He was the stranger who rescued that woman. He didn't die in an accident 2 years ago like they thought. He was in a shipwreck, but he survived. He was the man who got thrown in the hospital and forgotten about. And it was this woman who was making the journey to his aunt's house to tell her that he was still alive. And it was only because Mary had that totally bizarre nightmare that sort of led her to that shed that she found this woman who would have died in that shed and never quite gotten to the aunt's house, and so never could have told the family, never could have told Mary that her husband's still alive. It was because of that dream that fate aligned, and now her husband was back. Mary and her husband's story wound up being published in newspapers all over the world. I mean, people really could not get enough of this story. But despite how far-reaching this story became, nobody was ever able to come up with a logical explanation for how so many coincidences and this crazy dream Mary had, how it all came together to reunite Mary and her husband.
Yeah. I don't scream my pain anymore. Yeah. I let it sit. Yeah. I used to wake up fighting, thought I had something to prove. Every loss felt like a headline, every win never improved. Yeah. I chased voices in my phone, yeah, looking for someone to stay. Yeah. Didn't know the loudest silence was the truth, I ran away. Yeah. I wore smiles like armor, but they cracked when I slept. Had dreams too big for my
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.